Hi, my name is Amariah Condon, and you're watching Beyond Saugus. I'm right outside WCVB's studio for News Center 5, where I'm about to interview Ted Reinstein, a reporter and producer whom you've been inviting into your household for years on Chronicle magazine. Hi, my name is Amariah Condon. I'm traveling to exciting locations around the greater Boston area, and I'm bringing my camera with me. I'm here with Ted Reinstein, and he's a Chronicle reporter and a producer. So thank you for allowing me to come interview you.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
So you're very well known on Chronicle. You do a lot of wonderful segments. Were you,
Thank you.
interested in filming in high school? Was this a
Not even a little bit. Zero, zilch, nada, nothing, no interest in TV except watching it. Mostly the Three Stooges. No, I had no interest before I was about in my late 20s, but nothing in high school. I never thought about it. I always enjoyed writing, which I always tell people is the cornerstone. If you're going to do anything in journalism, broadcast, print, or otherwise, you know, you really have to enjoy writing. So I always enjoyed writing. I was always very interested in the news and always a big reader, but no, never thought about doing anything in TV when I was in high school.
So when you're contacting people to do your segments for Chronicle, have you ever had them say no, that they don't want to be interviewed? They don't
Oh, sure. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, I always say Chronicle is part of what's appealing about it is that while news is vital and important and part of what we do here, generally we do more upbeat feature stories where people actually are happy to talk with us. But that's not always the case. And sometimes for a variety of reasons, people there isn't enough upside for them to do the story. Sometimes, and that's usually not if it's a fun feature story. Usually that happens if it's a more serious story. It may be a story that people feel like may reflect negatively on them in some way. They're not being paid, and they just don't have enough, like I said, there isn't enough advantage for them, and that's usually when someone says no. However, occasionally it is just kind of a funny, wacky story that somebody just keeps saying no, and one of them is I often feature really peculiar collections things that people collect. I have been after a guy in Holyoke, Massachusetts for about 10 years.
Wow.
Who has the biggest collection of previously chewed celebrity bubblegum in the world. Now you might say, why does the world need to see that? Mm-hmm. And I agree with you. But somehow I've got it in my head that I'm determined. Anyway, this guy keeps saying no. I don't blame him because he's a respected lawyer. And I'm sure he feels like there's no way that this will help him in any professional way, maybe even socially, except to cause him embarrassment and disgrace. But I keep pushing him. But he keeps saying no. So there's somebody who says no.
So you just
Aren't you glad you asked that question?
So you just keep calling me like,
you're
hey,
thinking,
it's Ted.
you're thinking, wow, that was a long answer. And now there's 3 minutes of my life that's gone forever. Next question.
So the book you just wrote
Yep.
is some of your most favorite stories and people that you've met
Yes.
in your time in the
Yes.
Chronicle. Are there any that you didn't put in the book?
Yes, as a matter of fact. So New England Notebook, my first book, is sort of my favorite stories from almost 18 years of reporting around New England. But there are stories that didn't make it in there. And in fact, the second book about feuds was going to be a chapter in the first book. And I had such great stuff that I didn't think at the time that this could be a second book. I was actually forced to cut it because I needed to cut down the number of words. But it worked out perfectly because now it's sort of the beginnings of what will be the second book. So yeah, those stories of feuds and so forth, I never put in the first book. Now I'm glad I didn't, or I'd have nothing to write about. The idea for writing the book really came about because Chronicle is about 15 minutes of airtime. You think of it as a half hour, but it's really 15 minutes, and the other 15 minutes is what keeps Chronicle on the air. But the important stuff. But I got frustrated over the years that there was all this stuff that we could never really get into, the kind of detail I would have loved, the kind of detail you can get into with a book, with some of these stories and people and places, because we do have to cut it so severely for television. So a book is a platform where you can really devote more time, much more detail, much more nuance, and that's where it came from. Sort of a determination to do something, to be able to retell some of these stories in detail that was never possible when they were for TV. Do I have a favorite story over 18 years? And I'm always happy, delighted really, to say that not only do I have a favorite story, but I can sum up my favorite story not in 4 sentences, not even 4 letters. 4 letters. F-R-E-D. Fred Tuttle. Anybody ever heard of Fred Tuttle? If we were in Montpelier, Vermont right now, it would be as if I had just brought up the name of a beloved former uncle or grandfather. Because indeed, that's what Fred Tuttle represents to this day in Vermont. Fred Tuttle is Vermont's most beloved folk hero. Fred Tuttle is Vermont's most famous former dairy farmer. Now, that may not sound like a lot to you, but in a state that counted more cows than people till the 1960s, it's kind of a big deal. But it wasn't the fact that Fred Tuttle was a former dairy farmer that brought us up to Tunbridge, Vermont to do our first story. We did several on Fred Tuttle. It's also the fact that, in my opinion, Fred Tuttle is America's most unlikely movie star. Does he look like a movie star? Not so much. Unless, you know, he was made up and in costume, which in a way he was. He's not wearing makeup, but that's about the only thing that Fred ever wore. The trademark Carter's blue jean coveralls, the green shirt, the undershirt of some indeterminate origin, and when it got cold, he added to his wardrobe. He threw on that maroon warm-up jacket. On this day, it must have dropped to below 40 degrees. That's when he threw on that jacket. It never came off until April or May. He didn't add gloves, didn't add boots, didn't matter how cold it was. I never saw him add anything more than what he was wearing right there. Now, how does this guy become a movie star, you might wonder? Well, that's a good question. And it all had to do with who his neighbor was in Tunbridge, Vermont. Now, at this point in his life, Fred is in his late 70s, had a host of health problems. Kane gives part of it away, had terrible arthritis in both hips. Bad knees, bad eyesight, bad heart, bad hearing. Sounded like he had a mouthful of marbles when he talked. Other than that, he was an Adonis. But he couldn't farm anymore. He reached a point around 1990 when he had to sell off his beloved herd of Jersey cows. It broke his heart. Broke his heart. Had to sell off his cows. Couldn't farm anymore. Now, he had a neighbor who had moved back to Tunbridge around this point in time. Very bright guy named John O'Brien. John O'Brien grew up in Tunbridge, went off to Harvard, came back to Tunbridge to run his mom's sheep farm. And he was a neighbor. Their farms adjoined. And so John O'Brien is watching his neighbor for about 1.5 years, Fred Tuttle. He's watching him with his health problems. He's watching him auction off and sell off his beloved herd of Jersey cows. Now, John couldn't help him in too many ways, but there was one way that he became very curious about. Can anybody tell what John's holding in his hand? It's a camera. It's a camera. So John had a passion for movie making, but a very particular kind of movie making, the likes of which I've never heard of anybody else doing anywhere. Now, he calls it community cinema. Think of community theater, but with movies. He crafted movies out of real-life situations, using real people, never paid actors, people that he knew, friends, colleagues, relatives, and he fashioned a movie out of a real-life event, using the real-life people who were living the real-life event. So he's watching Fred, and he's thinking to himself, there's a movie here. Because my neighbor and friend, Fred Tuttle, needs a job. He needs money. He needs a job that doesn't require any heavy lifting. He needs a job that doesn't require any formal education. He needs a job more than anything that comes with blue chip health care. So John O'Brien thought of the perfect job for Fred in a movie. All he has to do is get elected to Congress. Not a lot of heavy lifting lately. I think we can all agree in a very bipartisan kind of way. So he began to put together a movie about Fred Tuttle running for Congress. Former dairy farmer running for the U.S. House of Representatives. And the movie was called Man with a Plan. Anybody ever see it? Very funny. Rough around the edges. It was made for under $200,000. That's less than what most Hollywood feature films pay for catering in a week. About the same, almost. So it was made on a shoestring budget, but it was a big hit. And John O'Brien, I think, gets credit. Who likes politics here? So I'm a bit of a political junkie. Came up with, I told you, bright guy, Harvard guy, comes up with, I think, in the movie, the best political slogan I've ever heard. So Fred Tuttle's running for Congress as a former dairy farmer. The slogan in the movie, Man with a Plan, as he's running his campaign is, I've spent my whole life in the barn. Now, I just want to spend a little time in the house. I told you, bright guy, Harvard guy, bright guy. So the movie's a hit. And in the movie, Fred wins. He goes to Washington wearing his Carter's blue jean coveralls. Yeah. And the movie was a huge hit. How big? Big. Fred was everywhere. Fred Tuttle from Tunbridge, Vermont. Can you believe it? It was a big hit. Big deal at the time. Big enough that we went up, we did at least 2 Chronicle stories on Fred Tuttle. That's when I met Fred. We had a great time. And if that had been it, if the movie had been a big hit, highest grossing film in Vermont state history, if the movie had been a big hit, and we had done some Chronicle stories on him, that would have been great. Everybody would have been happy. Everybody had a good time. That would have been good. But there was more. At this point in time, the movie comes out in 95. In 1998, the Fred Tuttle story takes a turn. And it was an unpredictable turn and an unbelievable turn. In fact, I have always contended, if you took what happened next with Fred Tuttle and took it to 10 real-life Hollywood screenwriters, 9 of them, anyway, would have dismissed it as being just too unbelievable. Nobody's going to believe this. Here's what happened. So 1998, Vermont's senior senator, Democrat Patrick Leahy, is up for re-election. John O'Brien, remember I told you, bright guy, right? Has a great idea. He thought, why don't we run Fred for real? There's no danger of they didn't really want to beat Pat Leahy, who they both really liked. They didn't figure there was any danger of that. And they figured they'd get all kinds of free publicity for their movie. Well, that turned out to be more wildly true than either of these two guys could have imagined. So I'll set the scene for you. 1998, Pat Leahy, Democrat, up for re-election. Fred Tuttle takes out papers to run as a Republican in the Vermont state primary for the U.S. Senate. Right? He draws a primary opponent, a guy named Jack McMullen. Now, I do have a picture. I was going to say, I just want you to picture for a moment Snidely Whiplash. I do have a picture. I'm not too far off, am I? Right? So he draws Jack McMullen. Now, Jack McMullen is a wealthy Massachusetts businessman who decided to move over the border from the Berkshires to southern Vermont because I think he thought he scoped out an easy race. Now, there's a word for somebody like Jack McMullen in politics, the C word, carpetbagger. Vermonters value authenticity. Do you know there are 2 brands, marketers will tell you, 2 brands in America that have to do with regions, places. and we live near them both, that are gold when it comes to marketing. One is Cape Cod, one is Vermont. You put Vermont in front of a product, and marketers will tell you it says authentic to people. So, here's one candidate. Here's the other. One, the other. Well, they had one debate appearance. Now, I told you I was a bit of a political junkie. I watch political debates and read political debate transcripts like some people watch soaps. It's pathetic, I know, but there it is. So they had one debate. This is now my favorite debate exchange in the history of American politics. I haven't read through the entire Lincoln-Douglas debate transcripts, but from what I've watched and read, this is now my favorite debate exchange in any political debate in U.S. political history. When I read this to you, it's only 3 lines. I think you'll understand why. It took place in the fall of 1998 in the offices of Vermont Public Radio in Burlington, Vermont. 3 lines. I'm going to read you the verbatim transcript. Fred, this is a milk production question, Jack. How many teats does a Holstein have and how many does a Jersey have? McMullen. How many what, Fred? Fred. Teats, Jack, teats. How many teats does a damn cow have? You know, we're relatively urban people, right? There's probably not a farmer in the bunch here. And yet, somehow I feel that if I polled this room, a majority of you would know the correct answer is FOA. Okay? Well, that eluded Jack McMullen, who promptly dug his hole deeper by mispronouncing 8 of the 10 Vermont town names that Fred put to him. Either way, the case seems to have been made, and on primary day, 1998, Fred Tuttle defeated Jack McMullen and became the official U.S. Senate nominee from the state of Vermont. Then, it got wilder. So, it's now Fred Tuttle against Pat Leahy. The Vermont State Republican Party is thrilled. Think of it. They have a Republican challenger who has the same name recognition as the Democrat. They couldn't have bought that. I don't know if they ever tried, but they couldn't have. They had it. They were thrilled. A little bit less so after Fred's maiden press conference. So at Fred's first press conference, he was asked what he thought about his opponent, Democrat Pat Leahy. To which he replied, "Oh, I like Leahy. I'm sure he's going to win." Then he added, "But if you really want to see me go to Washington, rent my movie." So the Vermont State Republican Party was wondering, maybe it isn't quite what we wanted. So I'm watching this happen now, and I'm delighted. And I went to my boss and I said, "Boss, do you see what's happening with Fred Tuttle?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "I think we should go up and spend a couple of days on the campaign trail with him. What do you think?" And he said, "How soon can you get up there?" So 2 days later, I was back up in Tunbridge, Vermont. And I knocked on the front door, and Dottie Tuttle, Fred's second wife, answered. Very interesting character, Dottie Tuttle. She answered the door, and I said, "Dottie, how are you? What is up with this Senate thing?" And she said, verbatim, "Well, I won't vote for him, that's for sure." I said, "Really?" And she said, "Well, he's just not qualified, and he knows it." Well, we were delighted. Any way you looked at it, qualified or unqualified, I was tickled with what was going on. So we went off to our first campaign event of the day. It was at a little elementary school in Tunbridge, 5th grade, so kids were 10 years old. And the teacher had told us beforehand, we might want to be in the room when Fred comes in. We might want to get a shot of that. I didn't know what she was talking about until Fred entered, and then I understood. So every single kid in the room, boys and girls, about 19, 20 kids, 10 years old, every single one of them was wearing Fred's trademark blue jean coveralls. Possibly the cutest thing I've ever seen. And Fred walked through the back door, and the kids were standing there, and they said, "Hi, Fred." And they were all waving. And just like that, he took off his hat and he rubbed his stubbly chin and he said, "Well, look at that. By Jesus, don't you know?" And he sat down. The kids had a little Q&A with the candidate. At one point, I remember my question. I raised my hand. I said, "Fred, how much money have you spent on your campaign?" And he turned to John and he said, "John, what would you say? $16? I'd say about $16. So the kids went out to recess and we sat down on those little desks. I'm going to tell you, you have no idea how short, small. I cannot remember. Those desks are like down here. That's what I remember most about that day. I went to sit down. I damn near fell right on my butt. So we sat down and I interviewed Fred. And first question, I said, "Fred, let me ask you." I said, "You know, the history of American politics is filled with unexpected outcomes. People who became president, and the trajectory never would have been predicted less than a year ahead of time. What would happen, what will happen, if you actually win?" And he didn't miss a beat. He said, "Well, first thing, my wife, she'll divorce me right off quick." Well, in the end, Fred didn't put Dottie through any such ordeal. Just before Election Day, Fred also did something that's never been done in the annals of American politics, at least as it goes with U.S. Senate campaigns. Fred made good on his presumption that Pat Leahy was going to win, and he officially endorsed his opponent. Fred's mom was from Reigate, Vermont. Pat Leahy's mom was from Reigate, Vermont. In a state like Vermont that counts just over 650,000 people, that practically makes Fred Tuttle and Pat Leahy brothers. So Fred made good on said that he liked Leahy and he backed it up. Despite endorsing his opponent officially, which I think pretty much sunk his future with the Vermont State Republican Party, he got 20% of the vote, but still lost. Still went down to defeat to his good friend Pat Leahy. And I spoke with Senator Leahy a couple times in the process of writing my book. And the senator, by the way, does a uncanny Fred Tuttle imitation. And I'd love to see him conduct a Senate hearing with that. But I talked with him about his recollection of the campaign and Fred Tuttle. And he said on election night, he called Fred to congratulate him as soon as the results were in. So he was on the phone about 7:02. And he called Fred. And he said, "You know, I called him just after 7. And Dottie got on the phone and she said, 'Well, he's sound asleep.'" So Leahy said he called back the next morning early, farmer's time early, 5:30 a.m. And he said he got Fred on the phone. And he congratulated him. And he said, Fred said to him, "Pat, I'm so glad you won. Because I had a nightmare that I won. And I was hiding out in the barn so no one would find me." But I love some of the things that Senator Leahy says about Fred Tuttle in the book. And I asked him to expand a little bit on some of his thoughts about him. And this is what he had to say. I just want to read you the end of this chapter. I asked Leahy what he thinks the essence of Fred Tuttle's unique appeal was. "Well, Vermonters heard him and they knew he was authentic as they come. What you saw and heard was who he was, and what you got, there was no guile whatsoever. He was nice. He was warm." There's a pause on the other end of the line. The easy, self-assured voice of the nation's second most senior senator and chairman of the powerful Senate Judiciary Committee trails off for a moment. At some point before he died, he told me that those last years of his life, riding around the state, meeting school kids, were the happiest years of his life. In 2003, at the age of 84, Fred Tuttle passed away at his home in Tunbridge, Vermont. By Jesus, he was a good one. I love writing. It's the part that I love about, well, I shouldn't say it's the part that I love most about TV. What I love is interviewing people and meeting people, telling people stories. I don't love some of the other parts of television, frankly, but I do love that part. And yeah, if you like to write, then what could be better than writing a book, you know? Because it feels like it will never get finished and you could never write enough. So if you like to write, it's perfect. It's perfect. But North Shore boy, grew up in Winthrop, and or as I refer to it, the charming little seaside town at the end of runway 32L. It was a noisy childhood, and I always tell people it was college before I realized that you didn't have to yell to be heard, which you did, living under landing airplanes in Winthrop growing up. I lived in Brooklyn for a few years, and I had a favorite uncle who lived in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn. And my favorite baseball team, I'm a huge baseball fan, but my favorite all-time baseball team is the 1955 Brooklyn Dodgers, who won the World Series. And my favorite baseball player of all time is Sandy Koufax, who pitched for the Dodgers. Now there's also a hard hat up there, which I've worn more than a few times back when I was doing a lot of stories on the Big Dig, and this is a relic from the Big Dig.
Wow.
This is a bolt that was part of the central artery. Talk about something that would fetch probably virtually nothing on eBay.
Now it's a bookend.
Yeah, now it's a bookend. Right. It's probably full of asbestos. And
Well, thank you very much, Ted. It was wonderful. Thank you for your time.
my pleasure, Amariah. My pleasure. Thank you very much, Karen. No, I do not have enough for everyone. Excellent. That was great. I wish I could do that full time, but I still have to do this day job.